Hello and welcome to Just Onside. As you can see, again, there's only two of us. Mr. Baj is he's back at work, and we've been told that he will be present on Friday. So let's see if that's the case. But we've got an interesting show today, and it's one that OS has been quite keen to talk about. It's financial fair play. The Saudis have taken over Newcastle. A bit of nonsense with Chelsea and a lot of players going to Saudi Arabia. But what is financial fair play? I'm not 100% sure what it is, but I do know there is a man who knows everything about financial fair play. So, Mr. OS, can you enlighten us all to what this financial fair play is?
I'm not sure I know everything about FFP. So
We'll
we've got the
soon
wrong
find out.
person. We'll soon find
Well,
out.
you've been telling me you know all about it.
I know a little bit about it. I mean, look, yeah, financial fair play. The reason why we wanted to discuss this is because you rightly mentioned it. It's been in the news recently with ownership changing hands at Newcastle. You've got ownership potentially changing at Manchester United, raising the issue with regards to multi-club ownership, and then you had obviously the Chelsea situation with a lot of players being sold in this current transfer window to Saudi Arabia and potential links between Chelsea and Saudi Arabia. So we'll get into that, but I think it is important, you're right, to mention or to cover what is the history of financial fair play and how it works. And it might be a boring topic to some, but it is quite an interesting area that's being developed and quite impactful, actually.
Don't make it too boring. We're losing viewers by the week, so I'm desperate that we jazz it up a little bit. So go on, Lewis.
No, indeed. So what is FFP? So it stands for Financial Fair Play. Now, in 2009, there were a lot of clubs being surveyed all around Europe with regards to their financial health, and it came across that at least over 20% of about the 655 clubs that were polled were in quite deep financial peril and were quite, not necessarily close to going bust, but were being run in a way that was not healthy. And UEFA under Michel Platini wanted to embark on a journey where there would be, let's say, a process and a set of rules that would mean that clubs, generally speaking, would be spending essentially what they earned in terms of revenue. So there was this kind of match based on what their cost was or what their expenditure was compared to the revenues that they were generating. And essentially how they went about this at the time was that this was the basic concept. They wanted to implement something like some sort of salary cap. Now, salary caps are difficult in this country and also in Europe because of, essentially, it's not something that we're used to within the European regulations in terms of the freedoms to be able to maximize earnings and what have you. Yes, it may be a very common theme and concept in North American sports, but it's very difficult here within the European Union to have this kind of salary cap restrictions to essentially limit the amounts that you can spend or pay players. So what they came up with was essentially this kind of break-even concept. UEFA did, which meant, again, just to repeat the point, that you can spend up to the point of what your revenues are. In addition to that kind of break-even concept.
Just on that, OS, does it have to have the agreements of the clubs, or is it something that UEFA can just do? What is the situation?
It's a good question. So the question you're asking is why? Why do clubs? What are these rules, and why do they need to essentially adhere to it? The point is that if clubs don't adhere to these rules and fall outside FFP guidelines or within their parameters, then they can essentially, basically the worst sanction that they can receive is that they would not be able to participate in European competitions. So basically, if, for example, let's take a club like Brentford, for example, if they did not adhere to the UEFA financial fair play rules, but never qualified for a European competition like Champions League or Europa League, then it wouldn't affect them. They would not fall foul of the UEFA rules. It only becomes relevant if you qualify for a competition that's governed by UEFA, essentially the Champions League or the Europa League. So essentially what they introduced was this break-even concept. But with this break-even concept that they introduced, what they allowed for is what's called allowable losses. So what they said is you've got to break even, but we'll allow you to lose a little bit of money, which was around £30 million across a 3-year rolling period. And FFP is always evaluated across a 3-year rolling period. Now, the Premier League then built or introduced its own set of rules. And if you remember, this was all brought about when Portsmouth went into administration and went bust. So that was the first and last Premier League club that went bust. And thereafterwards, because it was such an embarrassing episode to have a Premier League club actually go out of business, the Premier League then introduced its own set of rules. But what the Premier League did is they had the same break-even concept that that UEFA implemented for their competitions, but they allowed a larger allowable losses, let's say. So just to put it in comparison, whereas you had UEFA suggesting that you can only lose £30 million across 3 years, the Premier League allowable losses exception, let's call it, was 35 million a year, so 105 million across a 3-year period. And the reason for that, and I won't bore you with all the details, is mainly because the Premier League believe that they are the best league in the world. They account for a different class of wealth in terms of ownership. Their financial health is in a much better position, which is borne out by evidence as well. So they don't need to be as stringent and as prohibitive as the UEFA rules. So in terms of allowing for those losses, they allow a greater level of losses. Now, one more thing I will add, you've got the UEFA rules, you've got the Premier League rules, and you've also got the Football League rules. And that has been actually quite topical if you think about Derby and other major football clubs as well. The EFL, or the English Football League, their implementation or their creation of the FFP rules are a little closely aligned to UEFA rules rather than the Premier League rules. So they're, again, break-even concept. You spend what you bring in, but the allowable losses is closely aligned to about £39 million across 3 years. So very similar to the UEFA allowable rules. And that's mainly, again, driven, and it does make sense, to alleviate or stop clubs from gambling, trying to get into the Premier League, and therefore spending what they don't have, let's say, and then putting their kind of financial futures at jeopardy. So the EFL rules are closely aligned with the UEFA rules, and the Premier League rules are a lot more wider, which is why since Portsmouth, we've not had any other case of a club going bust. Now, you might say, well, we've had the Man City case currently with regards to the 115 Premier League breaches that are alleged over a 9-year period. But that's more around kind of source of revenue, remuneration paid. That's not necessarily about going bust, or did they, you know.
But in the lower leagues, Bury went bust, didn't they?
Absolutely.
And that was, when was that? About 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
Exactly. And that's why the EFL have a more tighter set of parameters and a tighter set of rules to avoid the very situation that Bury found themselves in. So the rules won't necessarily stop a club from
But the rules were in
bust.
place before. I mean, the rules were in place. Bury, it was afterwards, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But just
So
to make
the rules obviously never had the impact or the desired impact, did they?
Yeah, you could argue that absolutely. That the and I don't know if Bury were in the Football League. I'd have to check that. I think they were, as opposed to, let's say, non-league. But you're right. But that's the very idea. It's to minimize cases of, let's say, like Bury, where you've got this financial mismanagement. So your allowable losses have to be a lot more tight. And there's obviously also less revenue in the lower leagues. So your losses would have to be kept a lot more tighter, which makes sense to me. Now, the only thing I would say is what happened there afterwards, a couple of years ago, you had quite a seismic event, obviously, the COVID pandemic. And therefore, what happened in the COVID pandemic is UEFA had to get together and look at their rules again, mainly because during COVID times, two main things happened. You had teams playing behind closed doors, and you had obviously sort of not being able to fully realize their gate receipts. And you also had a lot of situations with TV contracts and rebates being paid back and what have you. So it affected clubs' revenue and revenue potential, let's say. So last year, UEFA made a slightly different or adaptation to the rules. And what they implemented was this rule called the squad cost control rule. And essentially what it is, and this was implemented last year, And it's really interesting for me. And I think this is something that's going to become a major topic of conversation for big Premier League clubs moving forward. And what UEFA said is, so a lot of clubs came to them and said, look, we've had COVID, we've had a lot of issues in terms of being able to realize our first revenue potential. UEFA also had the embarrassment of losing a couple of big cases, you'll remember, with PSG and Manchester City. Manchester City took the case to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and they won that case. PSG also had won their case. And because of that, there were a lot of clubs saying, well, do these rules have any teeth? Is there any substance to these rules? And the third main reason was that you had challenger clubs like PSG, like Manchester City, like other clubs saying, well, hang on, you created these rules with a view to avoiding clubs going out of business, but we've got owners who are good for it. We want to pump money into the club, and our owners are ultimately good for it. They've got bank balances, they can underwrite any potential debt to the business. So what UEFA did was, they still wanted to maintain some sustainability, but had this soft salary cap idea. So what they said is, we'll implement this squad cost control rule. It's really interesting. Essentially, what it means is that any money that you spend on putting the product on the pitch, so essentially that's player wages, manager and backroom staff wages, player fees, transfer fees, so transfer outlays, and agent fees. So any expenditure that you spend in terms of putting the product on the pitch, so we're talking about player personnel and staff and backroom staff personnel, that can only be 70% of your overall revenues. And the clubs have until 2025, 2026 to bring themselves under 70% of their wages and their agent fees and their transfer fees, 70% of their revenues. So again, just to explain, right now, you've got a lot of clubs where their wages and the transfer fees they spend and their salary remuneration for their manager and backroom staff, that's arguably over 100% of their revenue. So next year, 2023-2024 season, and it'll be phased in, by the way. So 2023-2024, it has to be 90% of your overall revenue. 24-25, it has to be 80% of your revenue. And then 25-26, which is the hard cut, all big clubs have to get. So all clubs wishing to participate in European competitions have to get into that 70% realm. Right now, the majority of clubs, there are a lot of clubs breaching that rule right now. So it's not a rule yet, but if today was to be in 3 years' time, let's say, or if 3 years' time the situation was the same, there'd be a lot of clubs not being able to participate in European competitions because, again, that denominator, that 70% of what you can spend in terms of the product on the pitch, right now, that's probably 85, 90, 95% for a lot of clubs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But again, it goes back to what I asked at the start. Is this, who needs to agree this? Do football clubs need to agree this?
No.
Or is it just a decision?
Well, those rules were put together by the ECA, which I think stands for European Club Association. So it was UEFA alongside, let's say, the Club Association, which is chaired, ironically, by Nasser Al Khalifa, the PSG chief.
Well, there you go. See. Also, it just is there any point of having this this discussion?
Exactly.
It stinks from the start.
You asked the question that who has to agree to it, and I reiterate, UEFA have brought about these rules in 2022. So it's their competition. The Champions League belongs to UEFA. Europa League belongs to UEFA. And these are the rules that any clubs wishing to participate in European competitions must adhere to. So in terms of agreement or disagreement, if you want to play in competitions sanctioned by UEFA, which is the premier European competition in the Champions League, and I guess the second second-tier European competition, Europa League, clubs must adhere to those rules. If they don't, those are the sanctions that will be subject to them, i.e., they will not be able to participate in those competitions. So clubs have no choice but to adhere to those rules.
But
so
what
again,
was with the City, where there was a plethora of cases? So what was that to do with? Because obviously there was a load of cases. It seemed watertight, and then suddenly, it's completely overturned, and it seems to be that City have nothing to answer.
with the UEFA piece, if my memory serves, with Manchester City, it was more to do, like I said, about source of revenue, sponsorship deals, where they're being fully transparent and honest about the remuneration they were paying. and what have you. Those were some of the charges levied by UEFA against Manchester City. And to be fair, obviously UEFA originally won the case, if you remember, and they were expelled from the Champions League for 2 years, I believe. And thereafterwards, it's only when Manchester City took that case to the Court of Arbitration for Sport that they won the case, and it was mainly, I could argue, on a technicality that too much time had lapsed before UEFA had brought the case. And just on an interesting side note, that time, so the statute of limitations had kicked in, let's say. And whereas UEFA rules have this kind of, and again, we're probably getting into the detail here, so we don't necessarily need to get too much bogged down. But where UEFA has this kind of statute of limitations of, let's say, 5 years or what have you to bring certain cases and what have you. And again, there was more of a technicality in that piece, and that's one of the reasons why it was the case was thrown out by the tribunal. The Premier League charges, the 115 that are currently still hanging over the heads of Manchester City, that does not have any statute of limitations. So Manchester City will not be able to use that defence when it comes to having to answer to the case of the Premier League charges. So yes, the Manchester City was on technicality. I think, again, for the PSG one, I believe it was with regards to their sponsorship deal with the, I think the Qatar Tourism Board. They signed a deal with Qatar Tourism Board, PSG did, that was worth something like 200 million, whereas their previous ones was like a tenth of that, their deal. So it was about inflating sponsorship revenues and what have you. So it's more about transparency and kind of inflating your revenues and hiding payments and not being transparent with the overall process and what have you. So there you have it. Again, one more point aside, one of the Premier League charges also is that City did not comply with UEFA financial fair play rules for 5 years as well. But anyway, we'll see what happens with that case when it comes to it.
Nothing. Nothing's going to happen. You know that. This is, I suppose, therein lies the problem, doesn't it? Really, because it's all well and good for UEFA, for the FA, for the Premier League to talk about this, that, and the other transparency, but ultimately, we've witnessed that those with very deep pockets and very much an influence in world football seem to have their way. I mean, Man City certainly have had their way. And what's going to happen if it's proved that there's been some irregularity? Are they going to take the trophies away from Manchester City? I very much doubt so.
Yeah, I agree. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with the Manchester City case. Again, one could argue Manchester City's defense is to kick it in the long grass, as we say, and to see how long it takes. So I don't think it's in Manchester City's best interest to have this case resolved quickly, let's say. But yeah, time will tell. But I do want to get your thoughts. So just to follow on from the squad cost control rule that we were discussing. Yeah, so I think you understood that concept. Yeah, so by season 25-26, all clubs wishing to participate in European competitions governed by UEFA must have their player wages, manager wages, backroom staff wages, player transfers, and agent fees at 70% of their revenue, no higher. Yeah, essentially, otherwise they will fall foul of the rules. But what's really interesting about that is to bring you back to the Chelsea topic, which we mentioned earlier on. If you remember, Chelsea obviously have started this phenomenon. I say started, but they've made it more newsworthy with regards to these long-term contracts. And it's all with a view to getting around some of the FFP rules. And I'll explain how. Essentially, you've heard the phrase amortization with regards to how the player fees are being recorded. So essentially, when you think about assets in football, they are your players. They are assets. And essentially how it works is, if you think about it, when a player has his contract, when he reaches the end of his contract, the player leaves on a free. That asset is worth nothing, and he leaves on a free on a Bosman. But how, for the purposes of the rule that I mentioned, the way in which a transfer cost, remember the third layer, transfer fee is paid, the way in which that is recorded in your books is how your asset is recorded. And therefore what it means is that if you have paid 100 million for a player and you've given him a 10-year contract, then the transfer cost for that player, his amortization cost for that year is 10 million only. So let's take the example of Mudryk. And obviously Chelsea in the summer started this with Fofana and Cucurella. But let's take the January example of Mikhailo Mudryk. They bought him for about 80 million. Now, if you gave him what would be a normal conventional contract, it would be 4 years. which by your maths, Ayub, what would be the annual amortization cost? 80 million,
20 million. 20 million a year.
Give that boy a gold star.
Oh, that was
now,
hard.
now, essentially, what they've given him is an 8-year contract, which means that they've halved their annual amortization bill for that player. So instead of it being 20 million, it's 10 million. And that's how the asset is recorded for that kind of annual year. And remember, it's a 3-year rolling period. And so that's all with a view. This amortization is all with a view to kind of getting around FFP. And one final point before I kind of let you have your thoughts quickly as well. When they created this squad cost control rule, remember, which will come in from next season, 90%, then the season after, 80%, and then the final season, you've got to get to 70%. That's a hard and fast rule. What they did at the time was also to relax the break-even concept that they had previously. So whereas previously UEFA said you could lose 30 million in 3 years, they've now extended that to 60 million. So they've given a lot of clubs some grace in that area. And what they've also said is that if you've got a healthy balance sheet, i.e. you've got a lovely stadium, good training facilities, a lot of players on your balance sheet, what have you, that 60 million can even be extended to 90 million, which means that break-even concept really doesn't really exist anymore. In fairness, not for the majority of clubs. So that's currently where we're at, and that's kind of brought you to what Chelsea were perhaps doing. Well, not perhaps, but were doing. It's all with a view to FFP. Now, I will get on to the Saudi piece and the links and where that all kind of comes in, because that is, again, all with a view to getting around some of the FFP rules, legally, illegal, whatever we'll come on to. But does that all make sense how I laid that out?
Oh, yeah, absolutely clear. Certainly clear for me. Whether it's possible to implement this, I'm not too sure. I doubt it very much. I have no trust in UEFA. I think you mentioned Platini. Has he been charged with something?
I think he may have, yes.
Yeah, there you go. So that's my issue. I mean, if there is an organization with integrity, there's a likelihood that perhaps it's going to implement an idea that has a basis where it's based on some sort of equality, but it's certainly not. I mean, this to me is just it's a lot of hot air. Rich clubs will continue to manipulate whatever rules and regulations are in place. Football isn't fair. It's always been where there are clubs that are rich, have got a certain profile, and there are other clubs that perhaps are just fortunate to be in the league. So I don't know what the objective is, this financial fair play. I have absolutely no idea, because there are clubs who this is not going to level the playing field. So I don't know what the objective is. For me, I don't give a damn. Personally, I don't give a damn. And the reason for that is not because I am indifferent to it, but I just do not believe that it's going to serve any purpose at all. Manchester City, for the foreseeable future, will still be one of the biggest, richest football clubs in the world. Same with PSG. As long as the owners are who they are, irrespective of what you try and introduce, it's not going to have any impact. If it does have any impact, these clubs are powerful enough to try and manipulate the rules. So this to me is it's almost a waste of time exercise. It's an exercise that's going to have no real desired impact. Whatever the impact is meant to be, it's not going to happen. So I just would not even waste time with this. I consider it to be nonsensical.
I want to ask you a question before I, again, just take you on to the more current topics with Chelsea, Saudi, and United's takeover bid. So in my view, I don't believe in FFP mainly because I believe that if you own a business and you want to be a disruptor and you want to spend your money on a club to build its product and to kind of, build your brand and what have you, and you want to invest large sums of money and you're good for it, then I don't really have an issue. The idea of FFP in the end ultimately was introduced with a view to the fact that a lot of European clubs had major public tax bills and were in great severe financial health, and they wanted to avoid clubs going bust. Well, that's one aim. And yes, you could argue if tomorrow Sheikh Mansour got bored and disappeared or whatever, what would happen to Manchester City? But the idea that you have wealthy businessmen coming in and want to spend huge amounts of money to take their club from nothing to something, let's say, I don't actually have an issue with. And I don't actually think UEFA have too much of an issue with it. They're now having to, I guess, pivot, and various stakeholders have different benefits or will benefit from this differently. You've got heritage clubs looking to preserve their kind of standing in the game, so they don't want challenger clubs like PSG and Man City getting above their station, let's say, and becoming part of the powerful elite. So again, if we just take away the names and everything, the very idea of coming in, owning a club and spending large sums of money to improve the product of your team, I don't have a fundamental issue with. And I would argue actually that it kind of goes against the idea of, kind of Western sports and what have you in terms of the product that you're trying
But
to
it goes against the idea of sport by its very nature should be fair competition, or at least there should be an intention that it's fair competition. That's the good thing about sport, isn't it? Where you have two gladiators and they're both equally matched. That is ultimate sporting contest. So if you are an advocate and a believer in true sport, then really what you should be trying to strive for is trying to level the playing field, or at least making it equal. So I admire if that was the objective, but I don't think it's possible to implement it. So I'm slightly different on that. That I would love it if there was some sort of cap or some sort of it tempered rich owners just pumping a load of money in. But I just think it's impossible. I think the genie is out of the bottle. I think it's difficult to now manage the game in such a way where it's going to be equal. I think we've just got to accept and live with the fact that there are rich people that want to own football clubs, and these rich people will spend. I just think whatever's happening, let it happen. If somebody who's a billionaire wants to invest a huge amount of money, so be it. That's the reality. We don't live in an ideal world. So I'm quite, as I said before, I'm indifferent to it. All this nonsense about financial fair play, it is nonsense. My opinion, it's absolute nonsense. It's a waste of time. I don't entertain it.
You've entertained me.
You've given me a tremendous explanation as to what it is, and I'm sure some of our viewers perhaps will be certainly aware of exactly what the details of financial fair play are. But my own personal view is, it's nonsense. I treat it with contempt.
like you do a lot of things.
Yes.
Yeah, indeed. But just to kind of finish off the thought, because I do want to get into the Chelsea Saudi thing very quickly. So I spoke about how COVID was one of the fundamental reasons why the rules changed, and COVID, in essence, affected all European teams, but it affected them differently in a lot of ways. To give you an example, the Premier League was the only league that during COVID was able to increase its international TV broadcasting deal by a third. Their domestic TV deal stayed the same, but they increased their international TV rights by a third, thereby generating more revenues for their international TV deal than their domestic TV deal. So just have a think about that. A sport that's played in England generating more TV money, revenue from its international TV deals than its domestic TV deals. Just to give you a little bit more context, take this previous January transfer window. Leeds bought, as you well know, I think his first name is Jorginho Rutter, I believe,
yes,
for about 30 million.
35 million from Hoffenheim.
35 million from Hoffenheim. Yeah, one player. Do you know what the complete total spend for Spain and Italy was in January?
It's going to be ridiculously low, isn't it? So it's going to be less than that. I 30 million.
It wasn't less than that, but 60.
60
the
million,
combined spend of La Liga and Serie A was 60 million. Just twice what Leeds spent on one player, a player who had very, very little impact. But we'll get on to that another day.
Let's but this is not a championship show.
Indeed, the Premier League spent 930 million euros just this past January transfer window. You might argue Chelsea spent 98% of that, but it was not.
But a lot of good it did them.
It may do in time, but it's just to put into context the financial might of the Premier League, and that's one of the reasons why the Premier League has these kind of larger allowable losses, because what they argue is our league's in fine financial health. We've got a licensing system. We don't have any issues with public tax authorities and what have you. Deloitte came out with their normal money league table and what have you. 11 of the top 20 clubs in terms of the most wealthy were Premier League. 16 of the top 30. It's just a matter of time before it's going to be the 20 Premier League clubs being like part of that elite 30 clubs in terms of the money league. So the Premier League, and that's one of the reasons why you always hear the Real Madrid ownership complain about the Premier League, blah, blah, blah. That's why the Super League came about, because they want to generate the bigger revenues, because they see that the Premier League is leading the way when it comes to kind of money. And that's borne out. You see that in the transfer fees and with everything else. Now, bringing it on to more topical matters, because I do think it's interesting and I do want to get your thoughts. So recently, there was obviously a lot of players from Chelsea making their way to Saudi Arabia. You've got Edouard Mendy, Hakim Ziyech, Kante went on a free transfer, some talk about Lukaku, and a few others that I've missed out on what have you. Now, the story here was, and it does link to FFP, because multi-club ownership, or the illusion of multi-club ownership or what have you, is a way of getting around FFP, because you own multiple clubs and what have you. And you can kind of bring players here and there and send them into feeder clubs, and you get the point, right? It doesn't need illustrating. So the point here was, you had a lot of players making their way to Saudi, basically generating more revenues for Chelsea Football Club because they're making player sales. And don't forget, in that squad cost control rule that I went through, the one thing that can be offset is your player sales. So the money that you bring in from player sales is offset against that 70%. So you get the point, right? So you've obviously followed the story with regards to that, the whole Clearlake Capital and piece, and I'll get into that. What are your thoughts? Do you think that that's something that was borderline unethical? Do you think that we need to wait for some evidence? What's your view? Because I have some views. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Unless there's compliance by the players, because what you've got to ask the question is, the players that you've mentioned, Kante's 32, he's still got 4 or 5 years. I mean, I'm not sure what his injury record is like. He's obviously been plagued with injuries in recent times, but he's when he's playing, he's quite a fit individual. I think he's still got 4 or 5 years at the top level. Mendy as well. Mendy's, what is he, 26, 27? So there is a lot of players that you've mentioned who've made the shift over to Saudi. They must have been compliant. And if you're sort of saying that there's some sort of underhand, some sort of skullduggery, are you saying that these players that perhaps still have lots of ability to play in the top leagues are quite happy to play in one of the worst leagues in the world, albeit very well paid? I don't think so. I think it's still a player's decision. So I don't think it's as clear cut as that. I don't think it's an obvious one. All right, hang on. There's something slightly sort of concern. The players have made a decision. They've been probably given the option, and they've probably decided easy money. Money is everything that they want, or money is what their primary driver is. I don't think at the moment I would sort of say that there is anything that I would throw, any accusations I would throw at Chelsea and with their connection with Saudi Arabia.
I want you to engage in a thought experiment with me. And these are not rhetorical questions, so feel free to answer. Okay. And there are some questions coming, I promise. So when Chelsea were taken over by many people, just the casual fan would think that when Roman Abramovich was sanctioned by the government, it was Todd Boehly who took over Chelsea Football Club. And to a large extent, that's true. But that's what the casual observer would know. The fact is that Todd Boehly, and yes, accompanied by a Swiss billionaire and his kind of LA Dodgers partner as well, they fronted a bid mainly by Clearlake Capital, which is a private equity firm. And Clearlake Capital owns 60% of Chelsea Football Club. They fronted up about 2.6 billion of the 4.2 billion that was needed to be raised to secure Chelsea. So Clearlake Capital owns 60% of Chelsea Football Club. Okay. Now, it's been reported that the Public Investment Fund, the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia, has billions of assets that are managed, let's say, by Clearlake Capital. Okay. Now, we know we covered on the last show that the Public Investment Fund has recently acquired 75% stake in the top 4 clubs in the Saudi Pro League. So would you accept, or what's your thoughts, if I told you that Saudi, the Public Investment Fund for Saudi, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, has finances that help secure the Chelsea bid. So they are essentially stakeholders within Chelsea. And I've laid out to you what the ramifications are if you don't adhere to the UEFA rules and what happens, an expulsion from European competitions and the revenues that brings, thereby hindering your financial performance and your value of your club. Do you agree that in that scenario, potentially there's a conflict of interest there? Because you are also part of the ownership of 4 clubs in Saudi Arabia that are bringing players from your other club, arguably, and I say other club in inverted commas or quotation marks, but bringing players in, thereby allowing you to meet or adhere to the UEFA FFP rules, and thereby allowing you the opportunity to participate in European competitions, thereby guaranteeing your revenues, which means that any dividends paid out to shareholders or even potentially the value of the overall business is inflated. So what I mean is, if you're qualifying for Champions League football, if you're looking to sell Chelsea tomorrow and you know this team's going to participate in Champions League football next season, well, those are revenues that you accrue for, because those are revenues that are going to come in. So would you agree that in that scenario, so this very specific scenario that I've laid out for you, to say, well, if we manage to secure players from Chelsea into the Saudi League, that gives them revenues, which is offset against their transfer sales or their sales, the squad cost control rule, right? So that's going to be offset, which allows them to meet UEFA rules, which then allows them to potentially participate in European competitions, which thereby bringing hundreds of millions of euros, thereby allowing us to also be paid, let's say, dividends, whatever the financial setup is, if there's dividends being paid out, or increasing the value of the club for a potential sale, because that's how private equity firms make their money. Would you agree that in that specific scenario that I've laid out for you, that there's a conflict of interest? I like how you giving it some thought.
I'm not sure whether I would say immediately there's a conflict of interest. It makes it possible, perhaps, for some sort of manipulation, but ultimately, as I said initially, you've got professional footballers playing at the highest level in the Premier League. Now, how the temptation is only financial, because in terms of quality of play, it's absolutely abysmal. So that to me, ultimately, players will decide if they want to go or not. They won't be coerced into going to Saudi Arabia. If the players were pawns where they could be moved and they had no choice in the matter, then it would be different. Then I would say there's a conflict of interest, because each player that has gone to Saudi Arabia has made a decision themselves, albeit it's purely based on greed, but it's a decision that they've made. Then I can't say it's a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest will be where there would be control, where if they said to Conte, right, you are moving, that to me is a conflict of interest where it's not in the hands of the player. It's in the hands of the owners or the clubs. So that's why I won't be perhaps saying it's a conflict of interest. I certainly think that maybe there is a concern, but I won't go beyond that. I certainly won't be as harsh as to pontificate that it's a conflict of interest. Not at the moment, unless the evidence sort of comes out that there are obviously things that have happened. But at this moment in time, no. Players have got a choice. Players are deciding. They're using an opportunity to make as much money as they possibly can do. It just so happens that Chelsea are at the moment associated with a number of clubs, or at least the owners are associated with a number of clubs in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and they recently bought a stake in Strasbourg as well in the French league. Something you've obviously been a vocal critic, Ayub, offline and online, of the Saudi league, right? And it's interesting when you think about what's happening with the United takeover. Just to finish off, I agree with you that ultimately for UEFA, it's better for them to have wealthy businessmen. Football is becoming more and more ever expensive for the consumer, expensive for potential owners and what have you, right? It's only the value of businesses, sporting franchises is going up, which means that the number of stakeholders or businessmen that can buy football clubs is shrinking just by definition, right? Because you know it's becoming it's getting to a point where only the very wealthy can even put together such funds to be able to take over these big sporting institutions. It's definitely the case when you look at the Saudi Pro League that for UEFA, it makes sense for them to not necessarily relax the rules, but they want wealthy businessmen investing in European leagues. When you've got the threat of, and you may say it's a pathetic league, the Saudi Pro League, but that's maybe how we see it or how you see it right now. But ultimately, it's still a threat because right now there are players that are competing or clubs that are competing for player services that have the option of going to Saudi. To give you an example, Real Madrid want to keep Modric. Modric was given a record deal by a Saudi Pro League club, and he turned that down to sign a 1-year extension. But the point is, it was an option.
Good on him.
The point is, it was an option. Similar, you mentioned Heung-min Son in the last episode, and right now we've got Bernardo Silva. Right, again, he is questioning whether or not he should leave the treble winners, Champions League winners, Manchester City to go to a Saudi league for the riches, no doubt. So it's definitely in UEFA's interest, let's say, to keep the rules as such to make sure that there's investment in the European leagues. That's nothing new. It's the same with regards to the UK government. It's the same institute. If you can get foreign investment investing in your institutions, in your economy, you're much better for it. And that's one of the reasons why I think the actual ownership situation at Manchester United is a very interesting one. I do want to get your thoughts on this because I do have strong views. So UEFA have a set of statutes, talking about the integrity of the Champions League and the Europa League, and I think it's Statute 5, Article 3, which covers essentially that if you are the owner of if you are the owner of a club or have shares in a club that's going to be participating in the Champions League or the Europa League, you are not essentially allowed to have ownership or shares in another club that's willing to participate in the Champions League or Europa League. And there's an interesting phrase in that rule, and I would, again, encourage anyone to check it up. It talks about directly or indirectly linked to another club. So it doesn't just say, oh, you've got to be directly linked to this other club. It says directly or indirectly. And what it says in those rules is that you're not allowed. So if you have ownership or shares in one sporting organization that's going to be participating in the Champions League or Europa League, you're not allowed to directly or indirectly be involved with another club that's participating in the UEFA Champions League or the Europa League. And the reason I mention this is because that's what the rules state currently. And when Alexander Ceferin, UEFA president, was interviewed by Gary Neville on the Overlap, he was asked about this, that your rules state that you cannot have the same owners at Paris Saint-Germain owning Manchester United. Now, he did not dispute the fact that they are essentially the same owners. You followed the story, Ayub. Yeah. Sheikh Jassim, he's the director of the Qatar Islamic Bank. Its largest shareholder is Qatar Investment Authority, which is their public sovereign funds. They own 17.7% of the Qatar Islamic Bank. And if you look at PSG, they are owned by Qatar Sports Authority, which again is owned by the public investment fund QIA. So the links are all there. There's not an issue. Even Sheikh Jassim's father, who was the former prime minister, he was previously the former chair of the Qatar Investment Authority, their sovereign wealth fund. So nobody's disputing. Even Alexander Ceferin doesn't dispute that this is essentially the same entity. And when he was asked by Gary Neville as to what he would do if the Qataris won the bid, he said in a very meek way, if I may say, that essentially we'll have to see and look to change the rules. And that gave me an insight as to the psyche. Now, they can't influence the decision about which company takes ownership, whether it's Jim Ratcliffe of Ineos or Sheikh Jassim of the Qatar Islamic Bank. They can't influence that because it's a Premier League club. But what they can say is, well, if Sheikh Jassim wins, because this is what the rules currently state, that PSG and Manchester United cannot compete in the same competition. And as you know, they've both qualified for the Champions League. But his initial response to Gary Neville was, well, we'll look to change the rules. We're going to have to revisit this. So my point is, it tells you, it's not to say, look, do I agree with it? I don't. I don't think you can have same ownership, because you can follow that thought process through at you as to what happens if they play one another. You might say, well, no one's going to throw a game if PSG and United end up in the final and the PSG guys say, hey, United guys, you need to throw the final. No one's suggesting that. But remember, when it comes to conflict of interest, it's about also the appearance of a conflict of interest. That's what impartiality and integrity goes to as to the competition. So in that scenario, would you, again, I've laid out why I just wanted to highlight what UEFA's approach is generally, and you can see how lax they are. They want to be very flexible and smooth, because it's in their best interest to have a wealthy Middle East owner come in to one of the biggest clubs in the world, if not the biggest club in the world, in Manchester United Football Club, and spend money on Manchester United, building up the Manchester United brand and what have you, and keeping that money. And if it means as a view to offset the threat of a Saudi Pro League, which doesn't benefit UEFA in its entirety, you can see where UEFA also benefit from that. What's your thoughts on that? Do you agree with my overall view that in a sense gives you a little bit of an insight to the psyche of UEFA? And what's your view generally on just that whole ownership battle and what would happen, because you've got essentially the same entity owning two major footballing clubs in different leagues?
Yeah, certainly on the point of owners who are owning major clubs, that is one where we have to draw a line, because again, it goes back to the integrity of sports. You cannot, I mean, you've just put this argument, if PSG and Manchester United played each other, what's to say that there's not some sort of conversations taking place? It may be that one team, perhaps it's more significant for them to win. You never know. You never know. So for the integrity of sport, absolutely. I'd be in a position where I think if you owned a football club, if you owned a club in Europe, you're not entitled to own another club in Europe. Now, what's to say that that individual, maybe he's involved in another company, but he's not the head of the company? So you don't know. We may have at this moment in time owners who perhaps own, or at least have involvement in 2 or 3 clubs, but we don't know about that. I don't know how transparent all the information needs to be. But again, it's there's always this element with me when I'm talking about or when I'm discussing football at this level. There is a certain level of corruptness. There's an immorality. I mean, I talked about Platini for a reason, because he was heavily involved. He was, what was his position at one stage at the UEFA?
No, he was president.
Yeah. Now he and a great player to boot in the past as well. But he was involved. I mean, we've got Sepp Blatter as well, who's taken many backhanders. His house is full of brown envelopes. So I always find it difficult to talk about integrity, morality, when the subject is full of immorality. The owners, UEFA, FA, Premier League, these are largely immoral beings. So it's a difficult conversation for me when you're saying, well, maybe this is not quite right, that's not quite right. If you're really going to tackle the issues at hand, we really need to strip away multiple layers. If we want sport to be fair, then really we've got to start talking about, right, we can't have rich, wealthy benefactors who are making it absolutely impossible. I mean, Manchester City, in theory, they should win the quadruple, the triple every single year. Is that fair? Is that good for sport? Is that good for the health of the sport? At the moment, in next season, we'll have maybe 2 or 3 clubs with a realistic chance of winning the league. Is that really what you want?
Yeah, and look, your overarching theme with regards to fairness and competition in sport is well taken. And I think, but I would say the horse is well and truly bolted with regards to that in terms of fairness and equality. And I don't think it suits the power brokers at UEFA, FIFA, to have such fairness. You know, you want wealthy benefactors coming in, spending big sums of money to improve the product on the pitch, essentially. And that's what's going to continue to take place, because ultimately that's what sells. And I think that's a conversation for another day. And I think a couple of things to that. Firstly,
just to chip in before, I mean, we talked, I mean, there was, I don't know whether it's maybe about 2 years ago, the Super League. There was talk of the European Super League. The more I think about it, the more I'm an advocate of the European Super League, because it takes it away. In a sense, let the cancer go away and let sport be free. And really, what I want, I mean, this is, I'm going to talk about the championship very briefly. And it's what I said. I said it half jokingly about it being a league where I suppose it's real sport. The contests are to a large extent quite even. And really, that's why I would want the Super League to exist, because it allows these very rich individuals who perhaps have very little morals to play in a league of their own, let it all be concentrated, and let everybody else maybe focus on the integrity of sport, what sport really should be all about. So I know this is it's on a different tangent, but I think it can't be separate conversations. I think integrity, morality has to be always part of the equation when you're talking about financial fair play, because that's what the basis of the argument really is, isn't it? It's about fairness.
Yeah, and I think you're taking it into that kind of a very holistic kind of view of what is sport, and we already kind of have this Super League. They just are within, or should I say, we have the parameters of a Super League, because you've got these super wealthy clubs in different leagues. Yes. So it would probably make sense if they actually compete with one another, is what you're trying to get at, because
absolutely.
that would be more of a fair competition within those big institutions. Let's say Manchester City, PSG, Real Madrid, etc., etc. I think, look, the Super League is a conversation for sure. I take your point, but it's definitely a topic for another day. The way it was presented this time around, a couple of years ago, with this kind of closed system where you wouldn't have relegation or promotion into the Super League, is where it fell foul. Although there were a few other ways it would probably kill a lot of the domestic leagues, in my opinion, because although the TV deals in the Premier League are fairly equally shared out, don't get me wrong, but it would kill the Premier League if you had some of the best clubs.
I don't think it would kill the Premier League. I think what would happen is it would make it a much more natural contest. So therefore, every season you wouldn't be able to guarantee who's going to win the league. So I don't think it would kill the competition. I think it would increase competition. I think ultimately the spectacle, it's not going to attract the best players in the world, because in a sense they'll be in the Super League. But certainly I'm of the other opinion that I think it would enhance the offer, because it certainly would be unpredictable, which really is the essence of sport, surely.
Yeah, I think I take
we're going all over the place.
We're going all over the place, but no, a very interesting topic, and I think it's one we should cover at some other point, at some other time, with regards to Manchester City's dominance and what have you. And I think that could lead on to the Super League discussions. But anyway, that's where you have it. Those are some of the views. We've given a little bit of a history of what FFP is, what it currently constitutes, what it will be, what you're seeing play out in the media recently with some transfer stories and what have you, and how FFP is impacting that, or at least driving said decisions. So I think that should at least inform our viewers as to kind of what's happening currently. So let's park that one, Ayub, if we may. With your permission, and
please, yeah. The light is fading.
The light is fading.
It's an overcast day today.
And just before I move on to our second topic of the day, I should put a caveat, and I think you should as well, when you're suggesting that when you have certain strong views about Sepp Blatter, that those are views shared by Ayub Patel and Ayub Patel only, not the views of the Just Onside community. Anyway, so
I think there's many people who share my opinions.
All good. Just guarding against that lawsuit. Right. Okay. So on to more topic.
They'll find nothing. They'll find no brown envelopes here if they want any cash from me.
Says the man with two houses. Anyway, so coming on to more light-hearted commentary and also very topical. The summer period, which is always rife with lots of rumors, and it's how the news channels keep it going at this time, right? With lots of stories about transfers, a lot of hope for clubs in terms of players that they may secure. So I'd like to maybe dive into a couple of specific cases with yourself, Ayub, a couple of interesting ones. So let's start with Harry Kane. Today we had news of a potential bid from Bayern Munich. I believe it was something along the lines of £60 million plus add-ons. He's obviously got 1 year left on his contract with Spurs. There was reports of said bid going in. There's some conflicting reports as to whether or not an actual bid was submitted. What's your thoughts, A, on the bid, with everything that you know about Harry Kane, and do you see him moving on? And if so, how do you see it? Where will he end up this summer?
I know there's a year left on his contract, but 60 million, that's for a leg, isn't it? That's a paltry bid for Harry Kane. I don't care. There's only 1 year. One of the best strikers in the world. So, in terms of whether he should be moving, I'd be mortified if he doesn't move. I think he has to move. This is the opportunity that he should end his career. I know there's some who say that it's not always about winning trophies. Now, whoever says that, I mean, to me, don't talk to me about sports, really. Sports is about winning trophies. Ultimately, if you're one of the best players in the world, you have to complement that by having trophies. So I've got a feeling that maybe United will make the bid. I think what they're trying to do is have a resolution to this ownership saga that seems to be never ending at this moment in time. But he has to go. Kane has to go this season. If he doesn't go, uh, I'm it will be a disappointment because again he'll be one of those players very much like Alan Shearer. I've made that comparison before, that these are guys that are very selfish and perhaps are just concerned about personal records rather than, I suppose, having the ultimate accolade, which is winning trophies. So Kane, I think the Bayern Munich bid, I'm pretty certain that that's, if it is a serious bid, it's not something that Kane would look at. But I think if Manchester United came in or Real Madrid came in, because there was talk that Real might be putting in a bid as well. But I think if Mbappe is going to Real, certainly that makes it null and void Kane going to Real Madrid. But watch the space. I think he's going to go to United. I hope he goes to United.
Would make it
For Badge's sake.
For Badge's sake, yes, indeed. I think the Harry Kane story is an interesting one. I've long since felt much throughout this entire season, looking at how things shaped up for Spurs with Antonio Conte, with the fact that obviously Kane was approaching the summer period where he'd only have a year left, which means the leverage slightly shakes or starts to pivot in his direction, right, in his favour. If you remember famously when he previously looked to create a move or engineer a move to Manchester City, he had a lot more years left because in 2018 he signed a 6-year deal, which means he was tied into a long-term contract. Thereby, Spurs were under no real pressure to sell, and they stuck there. They kind of dug in and did not kind of approve of any move and facilitate a move to Manchester City. Well, it's different now because he's got 1 year left, and normally football clubs will want to realize value on their assets. We've just gone through the FFP and amortization discussion. So I've always felt since the start of last season that this last footballing season would determine a lot about Harry Kane. And I think the way it went with the whole Antonio Conte situation, and then obviously now with Ange Postecoglou coming in, the fact it wasn't a successful season for Spurs in any way, shape or form, and the fact that there's a lack of direction. Now, I think the new manager will do okay. I do. We've spoken about him previously, but Harry Kane's got to make a decision right now. Does he commit and invest a lot of faith into Ange Postecoglou and Daniel Levy at a point in his career where it feels like a crossroads? He's 29, he's soon to be 30. He's obviously going to be, he's father of 3 children. He's going to, I think they're expecting a 4th as well. So he's settled, but it's now or never, right? That's the idea. It's now or never. And I believe the way this will shake out, in my opinion, is that it will need Harry Kane to force through this move. And I think he can pull it off. But to pull it off, he's going to have to burn the Spurs bridge to some extent. I say to some extent, down to the ground. And what I mean is, I think it gets Daniel Levy out of a bind if Harry Kane publicly expresses a desire to move. I think although Daniel Levy would still take quite a few pelters, let's say, from the Spurs fans for not giving Harry Kane the platform to succeed at Spurs, I think it would at least make it temporarily easy on Daniel Levy to sell, to say, well, now the star striker is genuinely publicly crying out for a move, and therefore my hands are tied. To some extent, we can't keep a disgruntled player going into the last 12 months of his contract. It means Harry Kane, for a short period of time, may have disgruntled Spurs fans who love him, but may well think, well, he's leaving at the first sign of trouble, or he's leaving now that we have obviously a difficult, maybe.
But you don't think any Spurs fan would begrudge him?
I think now they probably wouldn't. I think now they probably wouldn't after the last season. But I think in Harry Kane's mind, because he's a Spurs. I mean, there were some jokes about him being an Arsenal fan, but he's played for Spurs It's his boyhood club. I think in his mind, he feels as though in some way, obviously there's a huge, deep connection to the football club. So I think in his mind, he feels that he may well feel that, look, I may well be letting down the club. Maybe he's always had dreams of just playing at Spurs for the entirety of his career. Some players are like that. So maybe in his mind, he's thinking, well, I don't want to necessarily do something that's borderline disrespectful to the club, to the fans, to say, hey, I want to leave the club. I think that's where I'm going to.
I'd be amazed if that's what he's thinking, because I think he's been a wonderful servant.
But ask yourself this:
unbelievable for them.
But what is he thinking right now? Because he's not made any public statement about, and he might have kept sound counsel, but he's not made any public statement about wanting to move. So I ask you the question: does he want to leave? Because it's the only way. It's the only way that deal happens. Because Manchester United will need him to make enough disgruntled noises to create an atmosphere where they can get that deal over the line, and they can't do it without Harry Kane saying clearly, "I want to leave the football club," because that's the only way Daniel Levy, it looks like, it appears, is going to sanction a move. Now, I believe if Manchester United put 100 million on the table, in my opinion, I think Daniel Levy would sell. And I think he would be smart to sell, in my opinion, especially if Harry Kane's not going to be signing a new contract, which seems like he won't. The only way Harry Kane should remain at Spurs in the 2023-2024 season is if he signs a new contract. And if he doesn't sign a new contract, it's in Spurs' best interest to sell him. Would you agree with that?
I agree. If he doesn't if he doesn't sign a contract, from a purely business point of view, it would be insane to not want to sell him. I've got a feeling that he's probably waiting for United to resolve whatever needs to be resolved in terms of its ownership. I think conversations have taken place. I mean, it's hard to imagine. I think he's quite with the City saga. I suppose he'll look back on it and think maybe he could have conducted it slightly different. I think he's a lot more wiser. He's always been quite a sensible human being. As a footballer, he's quite sensible. He never gets involved in any nonsense. He's a family man, so I think certainly what he's not going to do is start making announcements and proclamations about wanting to move. I think he's much more sensible. I'm sure conversations have been had. He's in a position where I think he can confront Daniel Levy and explain to him exactly what his stance is, what his position is. Once the Manchester United takeover is finally completed, we may see some movement. As I said, I'm pretty certain that there'll be a move for Harry Kane. Spurs are not going to change. I think this new manager that's coming, I don't think he's going to make any radical difference straight away. Maybe after a year or so, maybe. Harry Kane's going to be 30. I think he's looking at perhaps his last hurrah, and it has to be with somebody apart from Spurs.
I think for the sake of public relations, I don't think Daniel Levy will complete that sale without Harry Kane publicly declaring that he wants to leave Spurs. I don't think it's a deal that you can just quietly do and say, well, Manchester United submit a bid of 110 million, 100 million, and Spurs have agreed to the deal. It will need Harry Kane, because Daniel Levy will not want to appear to simply just be taking the money. What Daniel Levy will want to appear to the Spurs fans, in my opinion, is that he was left with no choice, because he was left with a disgruntled player who had expressed his desire to leave, and therefore he was just simply facilitating said move to Manchester United. You make a good point about the...
I don't think Daniel Levy gives a damn about the Spurs fans. He's not giving a damn. I think in terms of his conduct, I don't think he's cared, and I don't think he personally will care too much. I think with this one, it almost, I would sort of say, as a Spurs fan, if I was a Spurs fan and Harry Kane wasn't signing a new contract, as a Spurs fan, I'd be thinking, if we could sell him for over 100 million.
Agreed.
It gives the new coach a chance to maybe pick up 2 or 3 quality players. So I think from a footballing point of view, I'd actually almost sort of say that in this instance, Daniel Levy would probably be commended for selling Harry Kane.
I think it's such a sensitive topic. This is the arguably, this is the single most important decision that Daniel Levy's had to make during his Spurs tenure. You could make that argument. Selling Harry Kane, a player who's going to end up being the top goal scorer in England in Premier League history, spent all of his years at Spurs, beloved by Spurs fans. You're right, he may not care about the fans, Ayub, and that's why I used the point about public relations. he can't necessarily just seem to be taking the money, because regardless of whether most Spurs fans would agree that yes, you should take the money, the only reason why you wouldn't take the deal in this summer is if you felt Spurs had a realistic chance of achieving Premier League glory, Premier League title glory. In that scenario, you'd say, you know what? I don't mind letting you leave on a free. I think we have a realistic chance of winning the Premier League next year. And for that reason, I'm going to risk it. I want you on our books. I want you playing on the pitch. And I want you to be able to deliver Premier League title glory. If that's not a realistic aim, which most would argue that for Spurs it isn't, then of course the sound business decision would be to sell. But I don't think Daniel Levy will want to appear to simply just be selling him. What Daniel Levy will want to appear, in my opinion, it's just my opinion only, is the fact that his hands were forced or his hands were tied, and basically he had to do the deal because Harry Kane made it very clear he did not want to play for Spurs next year. Right now, Harry Kane's not said that. He just hasn't signed a new contract. We don't know. We don't know what his views are.
Which is quite, to not sign a contract. I mean, you know, if a player's entering the last year of his contract and he's not willing to sign a contract, every fan of that club, really, if they really had the best interest of the football club, would be saying, look, sell the guy, at least get some money. He's still, I mean, he's one of those rare players that even with just a 1-year contract, he'll still command a huge fee. I think it will be in excess of 100 million. For a guy who's just got 1 year left, that is a fantastic amount of money.
Yes.
So I would almost be apoplectic if Levy didn't sort of utilize the opportunity that, right, this is a year where if he does, I mean, this is on the basis that he doesn't sign a contract.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm with you. I think if the deal's on the table of 100 million, they have to sell him. I mean, they just have to. And I agree with you, by the way, on the United takeover piece. I think that may well be delaying things somewhat because they're not going to be looking to do 100 million outlay and then transfer wages of over 250k a week for a player whilst they're potentially changing hands, the club's changing hands. So yeah, I think some of that needs to shake out. But very interesting topic, and I think it is the most interesting transfer story, even though it's not fully, let's say, lit up yet, because Bayern have made a bid today, but I think that's got a lot of legs yet in that story. Moving on to another one that's quite topical right now is Declan Rice. Declan Rice, obviously subject to multiple bids from Arsenal. This was in the works for quite some time. I think Manchester City have formally, I think, submitted a bid today or earlier today of 90 million, comprising of 80 million upfront and 10 million add-ons. Arsenal's second bid was 75 million with 15 million in add-ons, both coming to a total of 90 million. Both bids rejected. Arsenal looking to submit a third bid. What's your thoughts on Declan Rice, and where do you think he'll end up?
I mean, firstly, I'm a huge fan of Declan Rice. I think he's a fantastic football player. He's a player that I hope he goes to Manchester City, because at the moment I think what the talk is, his preference is to stay in London, purely because his family is there. And I'm always slightly, I suppose, perplexed when a player is more concerned about the location rather than the club. Gundogan has gone, so there is a vacancy there. He will know that he will be instrumental. He will be a key cog in that machine that is Manchester City Football Club. He will be coached by one of the finest coaches that has ever walked this planet. Everything to me would indicate that his right choice would be Manchester City, but it's up north. And maybe that's the issue. That's the stumbling block. And if that is the stumbling block, I'll be bitterly disappointed. I mean, his hero, Yaya Toure, played at Manchester City. So really, I almost sort of think it's quite poetic that if he goes to Manchester City, he'll be able to play in a position where his hero, or play at the Etihad, where once his hero graced the turf. So the right footballing choice for me would be Manchester City, because I think it's guaranteed that he will be winning trophies. I think it will be fantastic to see Declan Rice and KDB in the middle of the park, and Rodri as well. I just think that is mouth-watering. So I, from a personal point of view, want him to make a decision purely based on football. If it's football based, he goes to Man City. If it's based on family, he goes to Arsenal.
Boy, oh boy, oh boy, do I want to take you to task on this one.
Go on.
So let me get this right. You don't give Kylian Mbappe any credit for going to Paris Saint-Germain because, rightly so, you dilute the effectiveness or you dilute the triumph that is the French league because you say, come on, PSG are always going to win it. Similarly, we do the same for the Scottish league. Oh, it's always Celtic and Rangers and what have you. We have this. Not each title is considered equally, right? Not each triumph is considered equally. So let me give you the kind of alternative case. So what you're saying is that you think, I mean, you make it out as if Arsenal finished 12th last year or 13th.
It might as well. I mean, at the end, it was City won the league at a canter.
5 points, yes. So the point is, so City finished first, Arsenal finished second, surprisingly so to many at the start of the season, and I agree, they that was a surprise for sure. But you're telling me that the alternative couldn't also be true, which is that he may think. And you're right, London is potentially going to be an important factor in his consideration, and he'll make a decision that's best for him. Look, if you're given the choice between Guardiola and Arteta, who's the better coach, it's not a question. It's Pep Guardiola. If you're considering which is the better team, it's Manchester City. They've proven that they're treble winners. But would you not commend him for joining Arsenal if he thought to himself, hang on, I can be the reason potentially for Arsenal perhaps winning the Premier League title in the next 3 or 4 years? I could be the reason why Arsenal get into the Champions League latter rounds and perhaps, maybe get into semi-finals, finals of the Champions League. Look, do I think that's going to happen? Most likely not. But if he felt like, for sporting reasons, he felt I could be the reason, I could be the deciding factor as to whether or not Arsenal achieve major glory over the next couple of seasons, compared to joining Man City, where we know most likely, absolutely, he will win a Premier League title there without a shadow of a doubt. Guaranteed. Remember this idea of competition, unpredictability, the thing that you yearn and you crave, that it should be competition, it should be fair. And you're saying, no, he should go to a place where he's guaranteed to win something, which he would be with the Premier League most likely. And no doubt they would go deep, deep into Champions League, maybe even win it. But we know they've already achieved that without him. What you're saying is you would not commend him if he chose Arsenal because you think the better footballing move is to join Man City. Have I just got that right?
No. If he was to come out and say, I'm joining Arsenal for exactly the reasons that you said, yes. If he's joining Arsenal because of location, that's my issue. My issue primarily
he's not going to say that even if he joins Arsenal. Can you imagine?
He should do. I mean, he should be transparent. But
at the press conference, it was a close run thing. But let's be honest, it's easier for me, partner and my child. It's better to stay in London, closer to the in-laws and what have you.
And that's where my issue would be. That if he, I think that would be so commendable if he did say that. If he did actually genuinely believe, sort of, right, I want to be the difference. I want to be the 6 points. So I'm gonna add extra value to Arsenal, and I'm going to be the one that's going to take them to the next level. The next level being, if you finish second, the next level is first. But I don't think that's the case. So if that's not the case, then really he has to be joining Manchester City, because it's not based on football. If it's based on purely location, then to me I'll be bitterly disappointed. But also, as a football player, you want to play with the best players, almost sort of say, well, right, I'm going to play with Rodri, I'm going to play with KB. It's going to enhance my game. I want to win World Cups with England, and that's something that most English footballers who are playing for England at this moment in time should be thinking as well. That right, what I want to do is be the best that I can do. I think if I play under the best coach in the world, with the best players around me, it's going to enhance my game. So that's the mindset that I want him to have. So it's not just a case of, right, okay, I'll play for City. It's guaranteed titles. It's wanted to be the best that he possibly can be. And if that's the mantra that he's going to adopt, then going to Manchester City makes absolute sense.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree. In the end, he may well choose to join Manchester City. And if he does, fair play to him. You're allowed to play where you want once the bids are matched. I think Manchester City will not bid more than Arsenal. I think they will both put the same amount of money on the table. I think what would be worrying for Arsenal, what should be worrying, is the fact that Manchester City, it seems, have bid uh, at all. Because if Manchester City felt that Declan Rice, who apparently, by all accounts, has given his word to Arsenal that he'll be looking to join, if Manchester City felt that they had no chance of turning that around, let's say, or kind of changing his mind, they wouldn't have bid anyway, because it's a little bit embarrassing for the champions of Europe or the champions of England to make a bid and then be outbid by a team that's inferior to you, which Arsenal are. So that would and should be worrying for Arsenal fans. I believe, in my opinion, from everything I read, I think Arsenal will just get it over the line. I do believe that, famous last words, but I think it'll be interesting to see. I think he's given his word to Arteta. That doesn't mean he can't change his mind, but I do think Arsenal will finally get it over the line in the next couple of days. But let's see. No doubt that could.
But bottom line, he's a great player. Absolutely love watching Declan Rice play.
Agreed. Top player badge has slightly different views, which he can hopefully offer in the coming episodes. Right, we're gonna.
He's not entitled to an opinion. He's the amount of shows he's missed.
Exactly. We'll probably just give him 2 minutes of screen time on the next one. We'll finish off on Kylian Mbappe. This is arguably the most fascinating saga, and it is a saga with him and what's happening at PSG. Just to give you the facts, Ayub, he signed a 2+1 deal in 2021. Sorry, let me take that back. He signed a 2+1 deal in 2022, I think it was. No, 2021. I was right in the first instance. So he's now 12 months away from exercising that player option. That player option would be basically from the 24-25 season. Yeah. So he's halfway through his contract. He's confirmed to Paris Saint-Germain that he will not be exercising his player option deal. Yeah. So for the +1 element, which means that he's entering the final 12 months of his contract. It's created a lot of furore and a lot of media attention. Because again, just to confirm, he signed a 2+1 deal. He's heading into the final 12 months of his contract. He would need to trigger another 12 months from the 24-25 season, which he said he will not do so. So 23-24 will be the last season, according to him, that he will play for Paris Saint-Germain. Now, what he's saying is, I'm happy to play for Paris Saint-Germain next season. I'm just simply not going to sign or take up that +1 option, which means that he'll be free to leave. Which is exactly the situation he found himself in 2021. He was free to leave. He chose to sign a 2+1 deal at Paris Saint-Germain, spurning Real Madrid and leaving them at the altar, as you'll famously remember. What's your thoughts on this saga? Because it is a saga, and it's getting a little feisty in amongst all the kind of French media and news. How do you see this shaking out?
And you know my views on the French league. So the sooner he gets out of the French league and plays in a proper league, the better. And again, it's farcical. I mean, this is where player power just gets to a point where it leaves a bitter taste in one's mouth. But it is what it is. This is what happens. We have created monsters. I say we. I mean, sort of world football at this moment has created monsters. When you, I mean, I'm not sure what his salary is on, but he
60 million net.
Yeah, he exerts,
and if he stays for one more, if he stays this season, it's 60 million net euros, and he receives a bonus of about 90 million loyalty.
Yeah, I mean, he's dictating terms. I mean, it's player power gone absolutely mad. Now, when you're one of the best players in the world, then perhaps you can do that. But
one of.
Well, yeah, he is the best player in the world now, is he? I suppose he is. I don't know. I mean, it's unless he proves. I know he's done fantastic things internationally, but unless he proves it in a proper league with his proper competition, I'm not going to give him the accolade just yet. But this is the modern superstar player. They will dictate terms. He's in a position where he can do what he wants, say what he wants, and ultimately, he and his agent will decide what they do. It's not going to be the club. The club, he is holding the club to ransom. From a footballing point of view, I hope he moves. As I said, I don't give a damn about PSG and whether they get a transfer fee or not. It's of no interest at all. I just want to see Kylian Mbappe, a player that I've seen live in the flesh, and he is sensational. I joke that it's a joke league, but my goodness me, if you watch him in the flesh, he's sensational. He needs to play either I think it's Real Madrid. Obviously, it seems to be the destination that he'll eventually go to. But I'd love to see him play for a proper football club. And then ideally, I'd love to see him in the Premier League, but that's not going to happen, not at this moment in time. You never know. He might go to Saudi Arabia because obviously at the moment it seems that, again, money seems to be a massive factor for this guy. So maybe I suppose if the Saudis sort of offer ridiculous amounts of money, he might just sort of say, right, I'll go there. It's not beyond the realms of possibility, but until he plays in a proper league, he's not somebody that I talk too fondly of or highly of, even though I know he's a fantastic player.
You lost me at, if you see him in the flesh, he looks sensational. I mean, what you do in your private life, what you do, I mean, it's a matter for you and you only. I don't think you should be airing that to the viewers anyway. But
superb specimen of a man.
He is. I'm sure he is. You did make some very, very good points, Ayub, especially the bit about PSG. It's not so much about the fee for them, is it? I mean, they rejected 180 million euros bid from Real Madrid when he had 1 year left on his deal in years gone by. So they've rejected the deals in that time. They obviously then let it go on to the 2022, and then they've obviously secured him on a free transfer, and thereby no doubt paying him an obscene amount of money in terms of wages. But they ran it, they let the contract run its course. They lost leverage because at that point Mbappe can do what he wants, and it was at that point that he managed to secure a massive contract from PSG that kept him on. If you remember, famously he was paraded around with the 2025 on the back of his shirt. Well, clearly he doesn't have any intention to be around at PSG for 2025, which makes a mockery of that kind of hoopla, let's say. But in the end, you're absolutely right. This story for me is all about power and leverage. We talked about Harry Kane. In 2018, he signs a 6-year deal. And it's an interesting one because I remember thinking at the time that if you are a superstar, and I mean a superstar of the highest ilk, it makes a lot more sense for you leverage-wise to work and play on short-term contracts only, because you will have multiple bites at the free transfer cherry, let's say. So if you can make sure that your contract's running out every 2 years or what have you, it's not great for the club in terms of its planning around you. But if you're of the highest ilk, what does security matter? Because in 2 years' time, you can either stay with the club on a massive salary, because again, that's what they'll offer you to stay on. Or alternatively, you can move to another club who'll be willing to pay for your services, who won't have to pay for your services, but will be willing to pay you some sort of signing on fee and massive salary to come with it. And if the idea is, well, I wouldn't do short-term contracts if I'm a superstar because I could get injured and my career could peter out, you've then got these, we've spoken about in the last couple of episodes, these kind of slightly secondary leagues, if we can say that respectfully, where they'll still pay you a massive, obscene amount of money, even if you're compromised health-wise, or not health-wise, but it's form-wise, if you're not quite the player you once were. So if anything, I think that's one interesting element to keep an eye on, where superstar players signing short-term deals, because that's the only way you have leverage. And they are the kind of players that can move, or that, not saying deserve leverage, but can wield such power. Harry Kane being one of them, right now in the current situation. So I agree with you. This is all about power and leverage. There is some talk that what PSG are saying is, well, you'll have to move this summer. Well, the point is, how many suitors does he have? Realistically, it would seem it's only Real Madrid. Now, Real Madrid might be thinking, well, how much do we pay? He's got a year left, but do we actually want to pay a fee? Real Madrid's financial health actually is quite decent, even after the splurge with Jude Bellingham. Their balance sheet looks quite good. So the question is, do they spend an obscene amount of money to get him out now? And what Mbappe's saying is, no, I'll play the last season out, no problem. And the reason is, you could argue, 60 million net salary, although Real Madrid could give him that, but the 90 million loyalty bonus that he also gets by staying on this next season. And what some of the publications are saying is, he's told PSG, if you want me out of this club, you're going to have to pay me that loyalty bonus, which kind of slightly defeats the purpose of what is deemed a loyalty bonus. Surely the idea is to be loyal and to stay on. So you're absolutely...
No, that's what he's saying. No. He's obviously saying that I'll be loyal. But if you want to take away my loyalty, pay me for my loyalty. So I can sort of, in a bizarre sort of way, it sort of makes sense.
Exactly. And that's what you have here. So I think it's a really interesting one. It seems PSG, I mean, whether he's calling PSG's bluff, there's some talk that he wants some French players to come and sort of form this rebuild at PSG, and he's kind of holding PSG's feet to the fire. Who knows? It's difficult to tell. We've been down this road before in 2021. So the question is, will he move this summer? Won't he move this summer? And I'm not so sure, because I just can't tell if Real Madrid are going to stump up the cash. Maybe one to keep an eye on is this Qatari takeover at Manchester United, potentially. That could be a story that could develop, because no doubt they'll want to make a statement if they do secure ownership of that club. All roads point to Real Madrid for the most part, but surely Real would be better served to wait 1 year. If you remember, they've signed Joselu on loan, the former Stoke player and what have you, but they've signed him on loan because they've got a massive vacuum up front now with Benzema leaving for the Saudi League. The question is, do they sign him this summer? And maybe PSG would sanction that. But it seems Mbappe saying, well, I'll stay on. It's not a problem. But you're right. It's all about finances. So do I think he moves this summer? Honestly, I don't know. And I'm really not sure. When you're talking about high stakes poker, it's difficult to know without being on the inside as to what's going on. So Real Madrid, so the options are, he stays on, sees out his contract, leaves on a free, secures a massive contract from Real Madrid, no doubt. He moves this summer to whichever club, but that club will have to pay a big fee. And it's not necessarily that he's just going to end up at some other league or other club. Ultimately, this is a player who's going to determine whether or not he wants to play for that club. Just to give you an example, if Manchester United want Kylian Mbappe, it'll need Kylian Mbappe to sign off on that, because they won't want to spend X amount for a player who says, I'm going to kick up a stink in 12 months' time because I don't want to play for your club anyway. So you get the point. Like, you need the buy-in from the player to play for that team as well. So it'll be very interesting to see how it goes. I am not sure, to be fair, because it's just too much money at stake, and it's difficult to tell with this saga with PSG, Real Madrid, and Kylian Mbappe.
Bottom line is, I mean, I think with the way that he's conducted himself, whatever happens, it will be his choice. So if he stays, it will be because he wants to stay. If he goes, it will be because he wants to go. But wherever he goes, I mean, as I said, from my point of view, he is a great player. I mean, I always make fun of the fact that he plays in the French league, but he's a great player, needs to be playing in a great league, and it's not the French league. Right, and on that note, I think we should call it a day, because I think we started recording yesterday. So
I hope it's been informative and a little bit.
It has been. It certainly has been. I mean, obviously, with we keep on asking our viewers to make comments and really give us an insight as to what they think. It's certainly been informative. I think it's something which, in terms of financial fair play, it's a phrase that so many people are familiar with. But in terms of its detail, I don't think too many people are really aware of the details. So I think it's been really useful. I think it's given us an insight. And I think it's nice if you're a football connoisseur. I think sometimes it's nice to know the detail of some of the things that are happening in the football world. And this is the off season. It's probably the best time to get a real handle on this. So thank you for your input. It's been useful for me. I hope it's been useful for you guys as well. I hope you enjoyed the show. It's been quite a long show, but I think it's been one where I think we've had to dedicate the time because of the nature of the discussion. So thank you for your time. I'll ask you to do the usual thing. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Smash a like, please. Put in a comment. Would love to hear what you think. And until the next time, and I think the next time, perhaps there may be a third box with a man that you've not seen for a long time. We've not seen him for a long time as well. So it will be a delight to welcome back Baj. We've talked to Baj. We've had a word with his agent. Brown envelopes have been exchanged. So hopefully on Friday, we might see the man himself. The man, the myth, the legend. Okay, so thank you for your time. Thank you always. And until the next time, stay onside.